Welcome to SketchFormation. In this series, we talk to engineers about how they build and run applications. In this episode, I'm really excited to have Colby from the Scratch Foundation. He's part of a small team that runs mit.scratch.org. If you're not familiar with the website, it teaches people how to code and do a lot of different things in a very free environment, which is exciting and also scary from a developer's perspective. I'll let Colby describe the application to you here.
So I'm Colby Gutierrez-Craybill. I am officially a senior backend engineer for the Scratch Foundation, which runs scratch.mit.edu, which is effectively what we consider our application. Just some kind of like initial numbers about what it is. We believe we had somewhere between 200 and 350 million users last year. About half of those are what refer to as offline, which is just basically we have a standalone app that doesn't actually make use of our infrastructure that we have for the online users. So we have about like 150 million users that show up. Not all of them are registered, but links to Scratch projects will get passed around. We get stuff, we're looking at Google Analytics for all this kind of stuff. And so that's an estimate of kind of like the total number of users. We have about almost 70 million registered users. That's over the course of when the modern online version started. That was in 2013 was when this modern version started. Another milestone that we had was fairly recent in January of 2019. The online version switched from being a Flash-based application to a purely in-browser thing, which we spent a lot of time working on. And it uses React and Redux, and I don't actually do much with that because I spend a lot of time in the back end.
At this point, I interviewed Colby about 5 main questions. What is the application? Why was it built? How does a customer interact with it and use it? What might break or has broken in the past? And how do you upgrade it for new versions? While Colby answered all of those questions, I was whiteboarding without him seeing to make sure that my understanding of what he said matches at least somewhat what reality is. At the end of the interview, I revealed the whiteboard diagram and walked him through my understanding of his application. Here's the final whiteboard and a little more clarifications from Colby about things I may have got right or wrong.
What I gathered, Scratch, your application, give you a little logo here. I like the background you gave me as far as like this Mindstorm kind of thing of the book and like the ability to explore and create by, in a lot of ways, this feels like, at least your description of it felt like what I got out of college, right? Like college taught me, I learned how to learn and by providing minimal, tutorials and more peer learning experiences, you're teaching a lot of people how to learn things in their own way, because you can't prescribe that every time, and school is often very structured for that. So yeah, but then the why you explained of why does this exist was really about that, like enabling people, whether they're kids, students in general, just someone that wants to explore and learn different things, and then giving them that guided community in a we don't know what you want to do sort of mindset, but you obviously pay a lot of moderators and you give them features that enable them to do some of that exploration in a not just free but low barrier to entry sort of way, and flexible. I like the offline stuff that you talked about was super interesting, just as like, hey, I don't know your environment, right? Like you may have dial-up still, so let's make sure that this is the thing that works. And then these 4 cornerstones essentially of, like what you're that's the wrong button. What you're talking about with, giving people like the passion, the projects, the play aspect resonates a lot with me, because play doesn't mean you don't learn, right? Like, right now, if, like I could see myself 2 jobs ago or 3 jobs ago, or like if I was doing this diagramming right now, I'm basically drawing pictures. To me, this is a lot of fun. I'm sort of playing. I'm learning a ton, and it doesn't mean they're different things.
Absolutely,
they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And then I also added this piece over here of your engineering team, only 12 people. I find fascinating because you can do a lot with a little if you're focused, especially in cases where you have some resources to build on top of other things. If you're able to use some other services, and as long as like you don't have to always scale this with more funding, which I think is interesting, and how you're mindful of what you're building is cool. So jumping over here into the how, essentially, of let's start here with this customer view that we have. So I just put there's hundreds of millions of us, because I find that interesting how you didn't necessarily know with the offline version like who was using it, but you know get to that point later. But essentially, the application, the website is fronted with Fastly to be able to just reach those customers where they're at with the CDN. Because again, if you're requiring everyone to go back to a US data center, or you are going to limit the usability of an application, even if it has an offline component.
Yep.
So this piece here, let me dig into it a little more. This is kind of my representation of the browser itself, this workspace Scratch that you get backed by JSON. Like under the covers, there's this JSON piece, which is the representation of it. And then essentially, you moved from Flash to ActionScript to be able to enable that in the browser, which is...
Should I give kibitzing on this?
Yeah. If I understood
Flash,
it wrong, let me know.
Yeah, Flash was ActionScript, so we've kind of moved from ActionScript to JavaScript. Yeah.
It's all JavaScript now.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
I also have to say, like, this is the sort of drawing that we do ourselves. So it's really great to see this kind of playful drawing. It's so cool.
The sprite characters reminded me exactly of Miyazaki, sprites.
Oh yeah.
We're just like, the name. Yeah, of course, they're little black blobs, fuzzy blobs that live in crevices. But I thought it was interesting the call out here of, this is you MD5 hash them so that you can store unique ones. And remixes still require you to store the entire thing, but in a easily addressable in a object store native way. Which,
that's right.
If people tried to say like, oh, you only changed the eyeball, so I'm going to reference that first thing and then overlay an eyeball, like that doesn't work at a object store level. So
that's right.
Natively taking advantage of those tools was kind of cool.
Actually, there's just a kind of inject something in there. There's this kind of my impression from AWS with S3 and the E tag for S3 objects is that, like, as long as it's not a multi-part object, there is a loose contract that says the E tag is going to be the MD5 of the underlying object, and we're actually making use of that. I believe, like my understanding from sometimes when I hear about this through AWS folks, is that enough people kind of rely upon that it's probably not going to change ever. But we're kind of actually worried a little bit that at some point that will change, and then part of our whole system is just going to break because like we won't be able to see that E tag, because that's part of how we judge whether or not the data that we've been given really is the MD5 in it. But anyway, just as an aside.
And I don't remember how many of these sprites that you said you had.
About 2 billion now. Yeah.
2 billion.
Well, it includes things like images and sound files and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, that's crazy because MD5 does, it's like kind of known now that it has collision ability of, hey, this might be a problem because this might reference something else. So that's pretty fascinating to see like how that scales. And some people are like worried, like I have 1 million objects. There's no way I'm going to have collisions all the time. Like, no, actually, like,
it's something. Yeah. It's something that we like future design is taking into account.
Yeah. So this whole thing here, this component of it, I mentioned here is, Elastic Beanstalk under the covers of how you can deploy and run this with such a limited set of engineers and SREs, which helps with, a few things, but you still have stuff to manage. And then this API service here as one of probably the main, I'm assuming one of the main microservices that gets used has this, ELB in front of it, which calls out to this HA proxy service, or HA proxy. So you have a little Python app that talks to a database on-prem to do other metadata joins and other information gathering from all of your applications. When I come and I sign in again and say, hey, give me my list of applications, that's being fetched out of this. The offline browser is more of the same, which is great. like don't reinvent everything because you needed it to be offline. Like, oh, just wrap it in Electron. I'm sure there's plenty of customizations in the code for that specific use case, but allowing people to take this offline is a critical need in a lot of areas. So that's cool. That also calling out to this Node.js Telemetry API, which is essentially just Elasticsearch, not just, it is Elasticsearch on the back end that allows you to do some of those queries and get data. I'm assuming that's, both services are actually like sending, it's not just offline. I only drew the arrow at the time.
It turns out we don't right now because
Really?
because part of the reasoning for that is that we want to keep those things fairly separate. And so it's not that we probably never do it. It's just that like there's a whole class of information that say Google Analytics. We're relying upon Google Analytics to kind of understand the user base for the online version. The telemetry version is a separate part that we try to keep separate because, it may be that they're running the offline version literally because they don't want to have all the kind of community interaction kind of things and to kind of link that together with an account or anything. And so the telemetry part, they could say no, and then we don't see it at all. Or they can say yes, and we try to be very upfront that we're trying to see is like, you're using this, here's the blocks that you use, but that's it.
Yeah. And I'm assuming somewhere in there, there's a prefetch of all those sprites, right? Like that's all going to be downloaded and bundled with this offline version, right? So like every workspace that I want offline, I need to fill with all those, all those assets and sprites and JSON and whatever else.
Yep, and that comes with it. And it actually does make it fairly large, the library that comes with it. It's like, that actually is a limitation of, those same folks who might not be wanting to run it online because they have a slow speed connection. They still have to have some form of connection to even get it, obviously, and download it. So that is an issue.
Right.
Strangely enough, another issue for us to inject really quickly, if I may. We support, I think it's over 60 languages. And there's a lot of volunteers doing translations of things. And so it's mostly the kind of like interfacey parts to kind of like say create and the blocks themselves. And so those translations are actually fairly large by themselves. But of course, if you want the offline version, what are the odds that you're going to need 60 different languages? Like maybe you need 2.
Yeah.
And so we do have this kind of like weird, like, well, it bulks up the download for something that most people aren't even going to use. Do we have a separate step? And so, it's something we struggle with. But it's just a part of that bundle now.
The last piece we talked about here was this cloud data. And I was trying to think of it like how the data and the variables flow through and how people abuse it in some senses, right? Like, so we have these variables here, this endless bucket of variables that essentially gets poured into the system from all these applications, and your users over here being a little bit creative with their usage of how they're doing that. And so that data is coming down into this area. It's going through this authentication service and making it's JSON that goes into Redis so that other applications can subscribe to it on the other end. So they can feed that back into whatever else they're trying to do. But just that cycle of, you don't know if something's going to be used, so you have to collect it all because if someone wants it and it's not there, then that's a bad experience. So that sort of like flow of what you have to collect and how people are using it was interesting.
Yeah. I think you've captured it very well. Yeah.
down here, just a little bit on kind of these breaking changes, or at least the breaking assumptions of what you thought might be available or possible. And then different was, obviously, we talked about how do you support essentially large groups of people. You were mentioning that being brought in through the teachers, having large classrooms, and how the assumptions of all these connections get made, and then having to limit your support of classroom size based on those connections. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's only teachers that would ever have this problem, right? Like anyone that has, thousands of connections together, like a large group, like it just, at some point you have to say, I can't support that in the current model. So if we need to change to allow larger classrooms or more things, and I'm sure teachers get creative with breaking down their classes into like smaller groups and saying, okay, this is cohort 1, 2, and 3, and now we can use this thing, and just subdividing those things to be able to use the tool was interesting. And then the last thing here was essentially the upgrade cycle in deployments, where it's, the code and the repos are in GitHub. You're using Circle CI, and for the infrastructure side of it, it's a lot of Ansible, using the providers that Ansible has to call out to AWS. There are some restrictions here that you have for like these classic VPC environments, and not being able to burn down the world and redeploy everything from scratch, because it turns out that the Scratch website doesn't have downtime windows that I'm aware of.
No.
So
although some kids would beg to differ, because like it's such a weird, like have you heard of Hour of Code?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really actually more like 2 weeks of code.
Right.
And yep, it's just kind of like, it's basically one of the peak times, and it's actually quite difficult to keep everything kind of going flawlessly. But anyway, yeah.
And then the applications themselves are mostly using Elastic Beanstalk with the command line tool to make that process much more. I mean, there's opinions built into Elastic Beanstalk, but it helps you kind of just like, hey, I can assume this thing's going to work the same way from app to app, and it's not all bespoke, deployment mechanisms and stuff, which is really cool.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So that's...
I think one of the things that like struck us as particularly interesting is how Amazon made the decision that like you can take the product of a Git zip and effectively directly deploy that into Elastic Beanstalk, and like that was an insanely good decision. I think like whoever thought that up was like, yeah, we'll just aim for that. And it was just like, oh, that's the obvious move maybe, but still it's like the fact that was done to me is just kind of like that's where it went from being like, oh, you're just using someone else's computer in the cloud, it's not cloud computing, to where it really was cloud computing, because you basically could have everything in GitHub and you'd say, here, just zip this up and put it over to here. And the fact that you can do that, it's exactly like that little tiny engineering team can kind of like handle 12 microservices all through different repos and kind of do deploys in a way that isn't insane. It's super awesome.
Yeah, and using that lowest common denominator of a zip file, it doesn't even have to talk Git protocols. Because like Git could be a lot of different endpoints and have a lot of different, edge cases of what it actually supports. And just saying, like, well, if you just, if we just download it and provide a zip, that actually, like, turns out I know how to unzip something.
Yeah.
And the files in that zip can be, pretty consistent. So.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Colby, for coming on the show and describing Scratch for me. It was really exciting to see just what it takes to run something at that scale with that many varied customers. It was also exciting to see some of the ways that things may have broken or were unexpected before when you're designing it. If you want to learn more about Scratch, go ahead and check out the website. And if you want to hear more about how engineers and developers build and run applications, come back next time as we talk to another developer about how they're building their app.